During the Cold War, the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't just about nuclear weapons and traditional espionage. Behind the scenes of top-secret projects, the US military was searching for something even more extraordinary: the power of the mind as a weapon. This led to the creation of Project Stargate, a classified program designed to explore paranormal phenomena, particularly remote viewing, the alleged ability to see distant locations without being physically present. Officially launched in 1977 by the CIA and the US Army, the program recruited psychics, scientists, and soldiers to test whether the human mind could break through the barriers of time and space. Participants were trained to visualize enemy military bases, decipher secret codes, and even predict future events. But as the experiments progressed, disturbing reports began to surface. Some soldiers claimed they had seen things that shouldn't exist: invisible presences, entities beyond our understanding, and even glimpses of a parallel reality. What started as a scientific experiment quickly became a dangerous game. If the human mind could reach into the unknown, what else could be watching back? Although the program was officially shut down in the 1990s, many believe it never truly ended. Some conspiracy theories suggest that Project Stargate simply changed its name, and that psychic experiments are still being conducted today, hidden beneath layers of government secrecy. But the real question that still haunts researchers is what was truly discovered in these experiments, and more importantly, what might have been awakened. I know a lot of people doubt these things when we talk about them. Secret projects, military experiments. It all sounds like a conspiracy theory. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And there are things that, once you witness them, you can never go back. Project Stargate was real. The US government has always been interested in psychic abilities, especially during the Cold War. The Phoenix experiment was just one of many attempts to turn that into a weapon. They wanted soldiers who could see beyond human limits, read minds, predict attacks, and locate targets from miles away. The lab was hidden deep in an underground facility in New Mexico, far from prying eyes. The entrance was discreet, one of those windowless buildings in the middle of the desert, guarded by armed security, disguised as a regular research center. But down below, in the lower levels, something very different was happening. I was part of the project's security team, so I saw everything up close. But the real focus was on Lieutenant Mike Mercer. He was one of the volunteers, if you can even call them that, selected for the experiments. Tough guy, the kind that doesn't crack under pressure. But at the same time, he had an uncanny intuition. People said he could sense danger before it happened. Maybe that's why they picked him. The man running the experiments was Dr. Richard Calloway, one of the lead scientists on the project. Thin, sunken eyes, always in a spotless lab coat. He didn't talk much, but when he did, everyone listened. The tests started with basic remote perception methods. They would place objects in a sealed room and ask Mercer to describe them without being inside. At first, he missed a lot, but over time, his accuracy increased at an alarming rate. After a month, he was describing entire locations he had never seen before. Buildings, people, even tiny details like a wristwatch on a desk in a building miles away. That caught the attention of the higher-ups. Whatever they were doing to him, it was working. But they wanted more. That's when the brain stimulation and experimental drugs began. Mercer was placed inside a sensory deprivation tank, hooked up to electrodes, and given controlled doses of substances designed to expand his perception. LSD, DMT, something they called theta solution. No one outside the medical team knew exactly what was in it. At first, the results were incredible. Mercer started predicting events before they happened. Small things at first. Who would walk into the room next? Which number would land on the roulette they used as a test? But then, he started getting bigger predictions right. A major earthquake in Japan. Plane crash, 3 days before it happened. The scientists were ecstatic. The military, even more. If this was real, if it actually worked. They were standing on something that would change the course of war forever. But the problem with seeing too far is that sometimes something sees you back. I've seen a lot of tough guys break in extreme situations. I've watched soldiers fall apart after an ambush, seen agents lose their minds after months of psychological torture. But what happened to Mike Mercer that night? That was different. It was supposed to be just another session. Sensory deprivation tank electrodes, that so-called theta solution, injected directly into his bloodstream. They wanted to push the experience to the limit, to see just how far the human brain could expand its perception. The test chamber was on the deepest level of the lab. Dim lighting, monitors flickering, Dr. Richard Calloway and his team taking notes. Mercer floated motionless in the tank, with only a breathing tube attached to his face. The only sounds were the beeping monitors and the soft bubbling of the water, but this time something was different. 5 minutes after the drug was administered, Mercer started mumbling. Nothing unusual. Some volunteers spoke nonsense at this stage. But then his body stiffened. His heart rate spiked. His brainwaves surged off the charts. Something's here. His voice was hoarse, muffled by the breathing tube. The scientists exchanged glances, but no one said a word. "What do you see, Mercer?" Calloway asked, jotting down every word. Silence. For a moment I thought he had passed out. Then he spoke again, but it didn't sound like him anymore. "It's watching me." The room felt colder. I swear I felt it. Mercer's breathing quickened, his eyes still shut, his skin pale. The monitors flashed erratic data. "He's hallucinating," someone whispered. "No," Mercer muttered, as if he had heard them. "This is not a hallucination." The scientists started whispering to each other. To them, it was just a side effect, but I saw it. His muscles tensed, his body convulsed like something was pulling him from the inside out. "It's looking at me. I can feel it. It's curious." I'll never forget what happened next. The lights flickered. The monitors jumped to unreadable levels. And Mercer started shaking violently. The team rushed to end the session. They pulled him out of the tank. His body was ice cold, drenched in sweat. His eyes were open, but empty. "Mercer, talk to me." He didn't respond. He just sat there trembling, staring at nothing. And then, after what felt like forever, he whispered, "It saw me back." The silence in the room was absolute. In the following days, the scientists dismissed it as a delusion caused by the experimental substance. But I saw what happened. Mercer changed after that night. He was never the same again. After that night, Mike Mercer was never the same. They kept him under observation for 48 hours, but the doctors said he was physically fine. But something inside him had changed. He spoke less. He kept looking into the corners of the room, as if he were seeing something no one else could. The first strange incident happened on the third day. One of the researchers found Mercer sitting on his bed, scribbling frantically in a notebook. Page after page, covered in symbols no one recognized. Twisted lines, spirals, overlapping triangles. Something that looked like a mix of mathematics and ancient script. "Mercer, what is this?" He didn't answer. He just kept writing. His eyes were wide, his breathing heavy. When they tried to take the notebook from him, he gripped it so tightly that his fingers started bleeding. This kept happening throughout the week. He wrote non-stop, sometimes on paper, sometimes directly on the walls, with anything he could find, even his own nails. But the worst part was the voices. At first, the guards reported hearing Mercer whispering in his cell. Not unusual for someone who had been through what he had. But when the researchers reviewed the recordings, they noticed something disturbing. He wasn't speaking English. In fact, no one could tell what language he was speaking. Dr. Calloway brought in a linguistics expert to analyze the audio and the symbols Mercer had drawn. 2 days later, the expert came back with a report that left everyone uneasy. These symbols, they have similarities to Sumerian inscriptions, and some of the words he's saying, they sound like they're derived from Enochian. The room fell dead silent. Enochian, the supposed language of the angels used in occult rituals for centuries, a language associated with supernatural visions. Are you saying he learned this on his own? One of the scientists asked. The expert shook his head. This isn't something someone just learns on their own. Either he had studied it before, which I highly doubt, or someone or something passed this information to him. The atmosphere in the lab changed after that. What had once been a controlled experiment now felt like it was slipping out of control, but Mercer hadn't told them everything yet. The following night, one of the doctors entered his cell to sedate him. Mercer was awake, sitting in the corner, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. "The eye," he muttered. "What did you say?" the doctor asked. Mercer slowly turned his head. There was something in his eyes, something that shouldn't have been there. It's, always watching. After Mercer started talking about the eye, the lab was never the same again. No one wanted to admit it, but something had changed. The hallways seemed darker. The lights flickered constantly. Equipment failed without reason. It was as if an invisible presence was lurking through the place. In the first week, the technicians reported strange interference in the security cameras. Static lines appeared at random, like something was disrupting the signals. Until one night, one of the eye recordings captured something that shouldn't have been there. It was a surveillance feed from the hallway leading to Mercer's cell. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered, just like they had been doing for days. But this time, between the flashes, something appeared on the screen. A shadow. It slid across the wall, even though there was no one there. A dark blur, stretched and distorted, moving against the laws of physics. When the light stabilized, there was nothing. The security officer watching the footage didn't say anything at first, but the next morning, he called Dr. Calloway. "What the hell is this?" The entire team gathered to review the footage. At first, they tried to explain it logically. Camera glitch, system error, an optical illusion. But when they checked other cameras, they realized the same thing had been captured throughout the lab, and it wasn't just one shadow. There were multiple. That was enough to unsettle Calloway. He knew something was off, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. It wasn't until Mercer spoke about it directly that the truth sank in. They are already here. That morning, Calloway went to Mercer's cell. He found him sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. He didn't even flinch when Calloway walked in. "Mercer, I need you to tell me what's happening to you." Silence. Calloway sighed and pulled out a notepad. "These symbols you keep writing? This language, does it have something to do with the eye?" Mercer smiled, a weak, exhausted smile. "You still think there's only one?" A cold chill ran down Calloway's spine. "What do you mean, Mercer?" Slowly turned his head and looked straight at him. His eyes seemed deeper, emptier. "They are already here." Then, that same night, things got worse. One of the scientists, a young analyst named Ryan Moore, decided to review the recordings alone. He was convinced that all of this was just paranoia. He wanted to prove everyone wrong. 2 hours later, a security guard found him on the floor of the monitoring room, shaking, eyes wide, mumbling over and over the same phrase. "It's looking at me. It's looking at me. It's looking at..." They had to drag him out of the room. Moore was never the same again. They had to institutionalize him. The guy lost his mind. That was the moment Calloway finally understood. This wasn't just an experiment that had gone too far. It was a warning, and maybe it was already too late to stop it. After Ryan Moore's breakdown, the entire lab went into lockdown. The footage was classified as restricted access, and the military took full control. No one could enter or leave without direct authorization. The entire facility was placed under quarantine. The official explanation? A potential psychotic outbreak caused by exposure to experimental substances. But everyone inside knew that wasn't the truth. The real problem was Mercer. He wasn't just different anymore. He wasn't the same man. They isolated him in a reinforced cell far from the other sectors. No direct contact was allowed, but even then, what was happening inside that room was leaking into the rest of the lab. The cameras monitoring his cell began malfunctioning for no reason. Some just stopped working. Others recorded things that no one could explain. One particular tape stood out. Mercer was sitting on the floor staring at the wall. Nothing else. But on the audio, something was wrong. There were two voices. One was clearly his, but the other was deeper, rough, like something was speaking along with him. Then things got worse. The next morning, one of the scientists went in to check on Mercer personally. He entered the cell with 2 armed guards. They were inside for less than 5 minutes. When they came out, they were pale. One of them vomited in the hallway. The official report stated that Mercer displayed disturbing behavior and verbalized incoherent phrases. But I heard what really happened. He knew. He looked directly at the scientist and said his wife's name, described his wedding, mentioned his daughter, and then he asked if he still felt guilty about the affair he had years ago. Something no one else in that room knew then. He turned to one of the guards and described in detail the hidden gun strapped to his ankle. And then he smiled. His eyes. For a brief second, according to their reports, they turned completely black. No iris, no pupils, just an empty void. The scientist ran out of the cell. He requested immediate leave that same day. At first, the higher-ups tried to keep everything under control, but panic started spreading. Scientists couldn't sleep. Guards begged for reassignment. Some swore they heard Mercer whispering through the walls, even when no one was near his cell. Then Dr. Calloway made one final attempt. He argued that the experiment had to end, that Mercer was no longer human, that they were messing with something far beyond their understanding. But the military, they refused to listen. "We are on the verge of something revolutionary. We can't stop now," Calloway insisted, pleaded, told them they were playing with fire, and then the shadows started appearing outside Mercer's cell. No one wanted to enter Mike Mercer's cell. The scientists now only observed him through the cameras when they worked. The malfunctions became constant, and some recordings came out corrupted. Others had strange interference, static, distorted audio, and sometimes whispers that didn't belong to anyone inside the facility. But the last recording, captured just hours before, revealed something new. The image was glitchy, full of static. But one thing was clear. Mercer was no longer alone in the cell. In the corner where there was only a wall and shadows, something stood, tall, smoke-like, faceless. That was when Calloway decided to interrogate him in person. He wanted answers. He entered the cell with a recorder. 2 guards waited outside, weapons in hand. Mercer was sitting in the same position as always, legs crossed, eyes locked on the corner of the room. But he knew Calloway was there. "Do you understand what's happening to you?" Calloway asked, keeping his distance. Mercer blinked slowly. Then he smiled. The eye is always watching. Calloway clenched his jaw. "What is the eye?" Silence. When Mercer spoke again, his voice was not his alone. "It is not just an observer. It is a hunter." The light flickered. Calloway forced himself not to react. "A hunter of what?" Mercer laughed. A dry, hollow, almost metallic sound. "You think we're the first?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes black as tar. "You think humanity got this far on its own?" A shiver crawled up Calloway's spine. "What are you talking about?" Mercer tilted his head, studying Calloway like he was an insect. "It has been here before." He licked his cracked lips. "Egypt, Sumer, the Roman Empire. It shaped everything." Calloway took a slow, steady breath. "Then why now?" Mercer closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked more lucid than he had in weeks. "Because we called it." The silence in the cell was suffocating. "The experiment," Mercer whispered. "You opened the door." Calloway's blood ran cold. He shut off the recorder and left in a hurry. Hours later, he gathered the lead scientists. He told them the experiment needed to end, that if they kept pushing, something worse would happen. But the higher-ups disagreed. This is the discovery of the century. We shut it down when we know more. What if we're on the verge of a breakthrough? Calloway knew they were making a mistake, but no one was willing to listen. That night, an alarm went off. All the security cameras in the containment sector went offline at once, and when they came back, Mercer's cell was empty. The problem? The door had never been opened. Mike Mercer's disappearance was the breaking point for something that was already falling apart. The entire facility went into full lockdown. Doors sealed, security protocols activated, soldiers patrolling the hallways, but no one could explain how he vanished. No camera caught anyone opening the cell. No lock was tampered with, he just disappeared. But Calloway knew the problem was much bigger than that. After the disappearance, he decided to do something he knew was career suicide. He accessed the restricted files on Project Phoenix. He waited until late at night. The lab was drowning in a strange, heavy silence. He connected to the system and started digging. What he found was nothing like what he expected. Project Phoenix was never about creating psychic soldiers. It was a ritual. The documents talked about altered states of consciousness, perceptual gateways, and observing forces. This wasn't military research. It was an invocation, and Mercer wasn't the first. There were records of other test subjects years before in different locations. None of them ever made it out. They all vanished. Calloway felt his stomach twist. They knew. The government knew exactly what they were doing, and now it was too late. Then, the lights flickered. A sharp sound echoed down the hallway, something scratching against metal. Calloway froze. He felt it. A presence. Like something was there, right behind him. Slowly, he turned his head. The door was slightly open, but he was absolutely sure he had locked it. The air turned ice cold. And then, he saw it. In the reflection of the computer screen, a tall, distorted shadow stood behind him. Calloway spun around, grabbing a utility knife from his pocket. Nothing. But he knew what he saw. The lab was no longer safe. He shut down the system and left, forcing himself to stay calm. But the fear was crawling under his skin. As he walked down the hall, he heard whispers. Not voices, whispers from inside the walls. Then, an alarm blared from the medical wing. Something was wrong. He ran toward the room and found 2 security guards frozen, staring inside. "What's going on?" Calloway asked. One of the guards tilted his chin toward the bed. It was Ryan Moore, the scientist who lost his mind after watching the security tapes. He was sitting on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, muttering over and over again. Calloway stepped closer, and when he heard what Moore was repeating, his blood turned to ice. He's watching, he's watching, he's watching. And then, the shadows started moving on their own. Mike Mercer came back. His cell was still empty. But that night he appeared in the medical ward, sitting on the same hospital bed where Ryan Moore had been before. No one saw him enter. No camera recorded his arrival. The military surrounded him immediately. He didn't resist. He just sat there, motionless, staring at his own hands as if he had no idea where he was. But something was wrong. The doctors examined him. Physically, he was fine. But Mercer didn't speak. He didn't react to any stimulus. His pulse was normal, but his body temperature was 4 degrees C lower than it should be. And the most disturbing part? The shadow. The room was bright, but Mercer didn't cast a shadow on the floor. When Calloway heard Mercer was back, he ran to the medical ward. He entered alone and locked the door behind him. "Mercer, can you hear me?" Nothing. He took a deep breath and tried again. "What happened to you? Where did you go?" For the first time, Mercer's lips moved. His voice came out low, hoarse. "They took me." Calloway felt his stomach tighten. "Who are they?" Mercer slowly lifted his head and looked directly at him. His eyes were black as coal. "You already know." The silence in the room was suffocating. Then, suddenly, Mercer grabbed Calloway's arm. His grip was inhumanly strong. "Kill me." Calloway froze. "What?" "Kill me before it's too late." He spoke fast, desperate. "They don't fully have me yet, but they're close. I can feel them inside my head. They want a way in. A body. I am that body." Calloway shook his head. "No, we're going to help you." Mercer smiled. A wrong smile, like something behind his skin was testing what a human expression should look like. "There is no help." Before Calloway could respond, the alarms blared. Red lights flashed. He ran into the hallway. Soldiers were rushing past him in the opposite direction. One of them shouted, "Generators are failing. Containment system has been compromised." And then, the lights flickered, just for a second. But when they came back on, there was something standing at the end of the hallway. Tall, distorted, not part of this reality, faceless. The floor shook. The whispers grew louder. It was like the air itself was vibrating. Calloway didn't think. He turned and ran back into the medical room, slamming the door shut. Mercer was laughing. Now it's too late. But Calloway still had one last plan. If he could get Mercer out of there and shut down the experiment, maybe there was still a chance. But then, the shadows in the room started to move. They weren't going to let him. There was no more time. Either they shut it down now, or it would be the end. The lab was in complete chaos. Mercer's disappearance and inexplicable return had been the final straw. Soldiers deserted. Scientists begged to leave, but the higher-ups wouldn't allow it. Then the final order came. One last test. If they could cut the connection, maybe there was still a chance. Calloway and his team brought Mercer back to the testing room. He didn't resist. He knew what was coming. The guards strapped him to the chair. His wrists were cold. His face was even paler than before, like something was slowly draining him. The monitors flickered. His brain activity was off the charts. No human should have those readings. Calloway stepped closer, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mercer, are you still in there?" Silence, and then he lifted his head. When he spoke, it wasn't Mercer anymore. "What makes you think he's still here?" The voice wasn't human. It was deep, layered, resonating through the entire room as if it wasn't just coming from Mercer's mouth, but from the walls, from the air, from everything. The lights flashed violently. The glass windows began to vibrate. "You always thought you were in control." Mercer smiled. His teeth were wrong. Too long. "But we have been watching since the beginning." A cold chill crawled up Calloway's spine. "What do you want?" Mercer tilted his head, studying Calloway like an insect under a microscope. "You were never more than an experiment." The scientists exchanged nervous glances. "Your history, your civilizations, your empires." Mercer grinned. His eyes were bottomless voids. All cultivated, shaped, like an ant colony in a glass box. Calloway's stomach twisted. He wasn't lying. Outside, the military had already made a decision. The general gave the final order. Initiate self-destruction. No one could leave. Nothing could escape. The countdown started. 5 minutes. But inside the testing room, no one knew. Calloway grabbed Mercer by the shoulders. "If we're an experiment, then why?" Mercer, or whatever was inside him, grinned even wider. "Because you opened the door." His voice was a whisper crawling under Calloway's skin. "And now, we've stepped through." The lights exploded. The entire lab plunged into darkness. And then, chaos began. The countdown kept going. Aero 342 remaining. The entire lab shook. Lights flickered uncontrollably. Evacuation alarms screamed through the hallways. But no one could leave. The doors were locked. The entity wouldn't allow it. Scientists shouted, desperately trying to override the system. But the screens only displayed distorted code. Impossible symbols. Calloway scanned the room. Soldiers were firing their weapons. But at what? There was nothing there. Or rather, there was something. Something that bullets couldn't touch. The shadows had taken shape. Tall, twisted, moving along the walls as if alive. The entire room pulsed. and in the middle of the chaos, strapped to the chair, was Mike Mercer. His body shook violently. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. He gasped for air, fighting for control. "I'm still here," he whispered, voice trembling. Calloway stepped closer. "Then fight, Mercer. Don't let it take you." Mercer's eyes snapped open, black as coal. And then that voice returned. "You don't understand, Doctor. Dodu 14 remaining." The floor cracked beneath them. Scientists stumbled back, tripping over debris. Calloway gripped the control desk to steady himself. Reality was breaking apart. Then, Mercer's body convulsed. His limbs seized up. His whole form trembled as if something was pulling him apart. A deep guttural groan escaped his throat. And then, he screamed, a sound that didn't belong in this world, a horrific, ear-splitting wail. As if he was being torn from the inside out, the entity was losing its grip. 47 remaining. Calloway made a decision. He grabbed the classified Phoenix experiment files and shoved them inside his jacket. Someone had to know the truth. Then, he looked at Mercer one last time. For a brief moment, his eyes returned to normal. "End it," Mercer whispered. Calloway hesitated. But before he could do anything, the shadows surged. They wrapped around Mercer, swallowing his body in a living fog. And then, he was gone. Nothing remained. 15 remaining. Calloway ran. The alarm shrieked. The walls cracked. The facility began to collapse. Dodging falling beams and creeping shadows, he sprinted for the emergency exit. Go 5. He reached the door, and then the world exploded. Final recording. After the facility was destroyed, the military recovered a single recording. The audio was filled with static, but one voice was clear. Mike Mercer. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "You think you won." Silence. "But I'm already here." The Stargate project may have been officially shut down in the 90s, but the truth is, it never really ended. What began as an attempt to use the human mind as a tool for espionage uncovered something much darker and more mysterious than anyone expected. The Phoenix experiment was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Declassified reports suggest that other experiments took place, some involving consciousness manipulation, mind control, and even contact with unknown intelligences. But what if I told you that Project Stargate evolved? With advances in technology, research into remote viewing and expanded consciousness never stopped. Now, the government's interest has shifted towards something even more ambitious: the fusion of artificial intelligence and psychic phenomena. What once required a highly trained individual to see distant locations can now be replicated by advanced neural networks trained to detect hidden patterns, predict events, and maybe interact with something beyond our world. Recent reports suggest the existence of a new Stargate project, this time focused on quantum AIs. So the real question is, are we teaching machines to see beyond our reality? Or are we opening a portal we won't be able to close if you want? To uncover more secret experiments, conspiracies, and hidden mysteries, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming content. Now pick your next mystery, click the video on the side, and keep diving into the unknown. The Stargate project was just the beginning. What else is being hidden from us?